Session 6, where we'll look at the history of the English Bible. Now, of course, you've heard of names like John Wycliffe and William Tyndale, and you've certainly heard of the King James Version of the Bible. But in this session, you're going to learn the story behind each of those names. You're going to learn about a man who was sentenced to death and burned after he was already dead. You're going to learn about a man whose dying prayer was, "Lord, open the King of England's eyes." And you'll learn about how the King James Version of the Bible resulted from a failed meeting between the king and some of his subjects. In 1428, the bones of a dead Bible scholar were dug up, they were burned, and thrown into the River Swift. Now, this man had died about 40 years earlier in 1384. And then in 1415, a council of the Roman Catholic Church charged this dead man with more than 200 counts of heresy. And so 13 years later, his bones were burned and his ashes were thrown into a river. The man's name was John Wycliffe. Now, I must admit, if I'm going to be burned, I certainly prefer being burned like John Wycliffe was, after I'm already dead. And yet at the same time, it's still a bit of an indignity. So what had Wycliffe done to deserve this fate? He was a priest, he was a professor at Oxford at one point. So what did he do to end up being burned after he was already dead? Well, the charges that were brought against him included several different things, including that he denied the power of the Pope and he had a particularly strong view of predestination. But he did something else that certainly did not help his popularity, even though it wasn't the specific charge that was leveled against him after he was dead. And what John Wycliffe had done is he had overseen the translation of the Bible into ordinary English. Now remember Jerome's Latin Vulgate version of the Bible? It was a translation from the 4th and the 5th century. Well, 1,000 years separated Jerome's Latin Vulgate from John Wycliffe. Now, in that time period, many church leaders began to treat Latin as the only legitimate language for the Bible. The church became especially suspicious of putting the Bible into a language that ordinary people could understand. Because you see, from the perspective of many church leaders, the lay people shouldn't be allowed to hear and to understand what the Bible said for themselves. Rather, the clergy, that is the priests and the bishops, were to read the Bible and then tell the people what to do. But John Wycliffe disagreed. John Wycliffe wanted ordinary people to be able to hear the Bible in their own language. Here's how John Wycliffe put it. He said, "Englishmen learned the law of Christ best in English. Moses heard God's law in his own tongue, so did Christ's apostles." But you see, many church leaders disagreed with this perspective, and they thought that the Bible was the property of the clergy of the church. Here's what one critic of John Wycliffe had to say. He said, "Christ gave his gospel to the clergy and the learned doctors of the church so that they might give it to the lay people. But this Master John Wycliffe, he's translated the gospel from Latin into the English. And Wycliffe, by thus translating the Bible, made it the property of the masses and common to all, even to women." And this was the perspective of many of the people in Wycliffe's day. But Wycliffe persisted in wanting to get the Bible out to ordinary people in England. Now, it's important for us to understand that Wycliffe did not do most of the translating in his particular Bible. Rather, he oversaw others translating it from the Latin Vulgate into Middle English. And the first translation of Wycliffe was really little more than a wooden, word-by-word translation of the Latin Vulgate. Now, in time, Wycliffe's New Testament developed into a much smoother translation of the Scriptures. And Wycliffe sent people out all over England to be able to share the gospel and to share the text of this Bible with the ordinary people. And they were called Bible men. Now, later on, they ended up being called lollards, which was a derogatory term that means mumblers. And they developed small groups or cells in which they shared the Scriptures and they memorized the text of the Bible. Now remember, Wycliffe's Bible couldn't be purchased by just anybody. And actually the cost of it would be about 6 months' wages, because at this time, this was before the invention of the printing press. And so these Bibles were copied by hand, page by page, letter by letter, by hand, and therefore were very expensive. And still, these texts spread all through England. In fact, today, 600 years later, about 170 portions of Wycliffe's New Testament, his Bible, survive still today. Now, more than once during this time, Wycliffe was charged with heresy. But each time, something happened in the midst of the trial, and he was not charged with heresy and convicted after all. Now, Wycliffe died of a stroke in 1384 while he was attending Mass, still officially in good standing with the church. But in 1408, it became illegal to produce or even to read a Bible in English. And so in 1415, John Wycliffe was put on trial again. Now, he couldn't show up to speak in his own defense because of the unfortunate fact he was dead. And so in 1415, he's put on trial, and this time he was convicted, even though he was already dead, and he was condemned. Now, also condemned at this time was a man named Jan Hus. Jan Hus was a priest from Bohemia who had been heavily influenced by Wycliffe's ideas and had preached the gospel throughout Bohemia. Now, a century later, after this time, in the early 1500s, there was a German monk, and he was rummaging around in the library of his monastery. And what he found there was a copy of Jan Hus's sermons, these sermons that had been so shaped by the theology and beliefs of John Wycliffe. And as this German monk read these sermons, he said this: "For what cause did they burn so great a man? He explained the scriptures with so much gravity and skill." And that German monk who found a copy of Jan Hus's sermons was Martin Luther. Now, perhaps it shouldn't surprise us then that once Martin Luther was on the run from the church for his beliefs, one of the first things that Martin Luther did was to translate the Bible into German that the people in his country could understand so that they could hear the Word of God for themselves. But between the days of Wycliffe in the late 1300s and Martin Luther in the early 1500s, something happened very, very important that made Martin Luther's translation far closer to the original text of the New Testament and Old Testament than Wycliffe's had been. Now remember, Wycliffe's Bible was not a translation from the original Greek and Hebrew and Aramaic text of the New Testament and the Old Testament. Wycliffe's translation was a translation of a translation. His source text was the Latin Vulgate. And so Wycliffe's translation, a translation of a translation from the Latin. But three very important things happened in the 1400s that set the stage to make the original text of the New Testament available much more widely than it had been for centuries. And the three developments were this. First and foremost, mass printing became possible. Remember that we talked about earlier how Johannes Gutenberg developed a movable metal-type printing press that allowed for the mass production of documents. But the second thing that happened was that a Muslim army conquered Constantinople. In 1453, the Ottoman Turks took over the ancient city of Constantinople, and it fell to them. And Christian scholars fled to the west, fled to Europe. And when they did, what many of them brought were their most precious possessions, which were Greek manuscripts of the New Testament. Now, there was also another thing that happened, a third one, which is that there was a major renaissance of interest in ancient languages that had developed in European universities. In fact, in 1458, European universities began to offer classes in Greek for the first time. So these three different events, the invention of a movable metal-type printing press, the fall of Constantinople to the Muslims, and a renaissance of interest in ancient languages together enabled a Roman Catholic scholar named Desiderius Erasmus of Rotterdam to bring together and launch a project that would change the world. And it was the first published Greek New Testament. Now, oddly enough, Erasmus's primary purpose hadn't been to publish a Greek New Testament at all. In fact, here's what his primary purpose was, it seems, is that he wanted people to see his new version of the Latin Vulgate. And so he pulled together a Greek New Testament to lay alongside the Latin Vulgate. And so he had the Greek in the left column of each page, and he had the Latin Vulgate in the right column of each page, because he wanted people to see how his version of the Latin Vulgate ran very close to the Greek original. And this 1516 edition that he called the Novum Instrumentum Omne, this 1516 edition was actually quite poorly edited. In fact, people have sometimes jokingly called it the most poorly edited book in the history of publishing. But he published it anyway. It was the first Greek New Testament ever to be published, and it was published in 1516. But despite all of its weaknesses, this edition of the Greek New Testament was the one that rocked Martin Luther's world. Because you see, Martin Luther was this monk who had been utterly racked and torn by guilt and wondering how he could be made right with God. And he ran across in this Greek New Testament the verse Romans 1:17, where it says that the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith. And reading that text, Martin Luther realized this. He realized that the only way to be made right with God was by God's grace through faith in Jesus Christ, that there was no other way. And so in the midst of that, Erasmus's New Testament, despite any weaknesses it may have had, God used it to transform Martin Luther's life. But of course, Erasmus corrected and improved this Greek New Testament over 5 different editions, the 3rd edition being one of the most important of these early editions of the Greek New Testament. Now, it was not without its flaws, even in its final form, Erasmus's Greek New Testament. Because you see, he only possessed, when he pulled this together, 7 different Greek manuscripts. And his manuscript of Revelation even lacked the last part of Revelation. So the way he got his Greek text of Revelation in the last pages was to translate backwards, going from Latin backwards into Greek. And so his text, even despite these weaknesses, and despite the fact that the 7 Greek manuscripts he had were not the oldest and were not the best Greek manuscripts, it was the only Greek New Testament that was available. And so it was widely used, and it was widely distributed, and it was widely copied. Some of the most widely used editions of Erasmus's Greek New Testament were the ones that were printed by a man named Etienne, or Stephanus, Robert Stephanus. And he published several editions of the Greek New Testament that were based on Erasmus's work. And the Stephanus Greek New Testament, a couple of editions of it, were the ones that were used by the translators of the King James Version several years later. It was the Stephanus Greek New Testament as well that introduced verse divisions into the Bible. You see, when Paul wrote his original letters and when the gospel writers wrote their gospels, there were no chapters and there were no verses. And chapters had been introduced several years earlier, but it was in the Stephanus Greek New Testament where verse divisions began to be introduced. Now, the entire line of Greek New Testaments that traces all the way back to Erasmus's 1516 edition are called the Textus Receptus. They became known as the received text, or Textus Receptus in Latin. And none of these was completely identical to any of the others, but all of them could be traced back to Erasmus's 1516 Greek New Testament. Now, the 3rd edition of Erasmus's Greek New Testament, it's the one that was used by a man named William Tyndale to translate the scriptures into English for the first time from the original languages. William Tyndale was the first one to go back to the original Hebrew and Aramaic and Greek and to translate the Bible from those languages into English. Now, it's almost impossible to overstate the importance of William Tyndale for the English Bible as well as for the English language, the importance of Tyndale in the history of the English Bible. In fact, he's often called the father of the English Bible. And if you read the Bible in English, you can thank William Tyndale at some level, because his scholarship shaped almost every text that you read in the New Testament. Now, William Tyndale was one of the most brilliant scholars in 16th century England. By the time he graduated from Cambridge University, he was fluent in 8 languages, including Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek. When he began studying for his doctorate in theology, he was upset, chagrined because of the fact that his degree in theology didn't include any study of the Bible. And so he began having Bible studies with some of his fellow students at the university. Now, eventually, when William Tyndale graduated, he became a chaplain and a tutor for a wealthy family. And one evening, while he was eating dinner with this wealthy family, there was a visiting priest. And the visiting priest said this, "We're better off without God's law than we would be without the Pope's law." And when William Tyndale heard this, here's what he said back. He said, "If God spares my life, I will cause a boy that driveth the plow to know more of Scripture than you do." Tyndale's passion became for every person in England to be able to have access to the Bible in the English language. But his bishop that was over him refused to allow him to translate the Bible into English. And so William Tyndale went to Germany, where he thought that he could translate the Bible in peace. And so in 1526, a printer in Germany produced 6,000 copies of Tyndale's New Testament in English. Now, when Tyndale's New Testaments were sent over to England, the bishops in England bought as many copies of them as they could at inflated prices and burned them. But William Tyndale wasn't upset by this. He said, "That bishop will burn my New Testament, and I am all the gladder. The overplus of the money shall make me more studious to correct the New Testament, and so to imprint the same once again." And that's precisely what he did. The bishops bought the Bibles, and they burned them, and he used the money to be able to correct and to publish more of them and send them to England. And his revised version of his New Testament was absolutely a masterpiece. In that, Tyndale even coined a lot of different words that you and I use today without even thinking about it. He was the first one to come up with the word beautiful, for example. Words like Passover and peacemaker and scapegoat, all of these were words that were coined by William Tyndale. Now, in the end, it wasn't his translation of the Bible that cost William Tyndale his life. It wasn't that at all. It was actually the many marriages of King Henry VIII. Because remember, the king during this era was King Henry VIII, and he's well known even today for his many wives. And Tyndale wrote a tract that denounced the way in which Henry VIII had disposed of his wife Catherine. And Tyndale then became a wanted man. In 1536, a false friend betrayed Tyndale to the king's soldiers, and William Tyndale was captured, he was strangled, and he was burned. Now, the actual charge against William Tyndale is a ridiculous charge. It was that he had made a corrupt translation of the Bible. In fact, William Tyndale hadn't made a corrupt translation of the Bible. He had made one of the finest translations of the Bible in all of history. And yet his last words were these, "Lord, open the King of England's eyes." Lord, open the King of England's eyes. And in the end, God answered his prayer. Well, a year or so after Tyndale's death, King Henry VIII approved the Matthew's Bible, which was a completed edition of William Tyndale's work. And in between the Old Testament and the New Testament, there are the initials WT to show where this came from, that this was indeed a completed edition of the work of William Tyndale to get the Bible into the English language. Now, about a year after that, the king placed a Great Bible, which was a revised edition of the Matthew's Bible, which was a completion of Tyndale's translation, in every church in England. Every church. And so Tyndale's dream had been to make the Bible accessible to the plowboy, to everybody in England. And now, even if the boy at the plow couldn't afford his own copy of the Bible, he could go to any church in England, and there was a Bible there for him to read. Now, Tyndale's translation influenced many, many later English translations. One of those was the Geneva Bible. Now, the Geneva Bible was sort of one of the first study Bibles. It had study notes that went in the margins to explain things, to help you understand better what was being said in the Bible. It was the Bible of William Shakespeare. It was the Bible that the Pilgrims brought across the Atlantic to the American colonies in the 17th century. But probably Tyndale's greatest impact came through the King James Version of the Bible. Now, the King James Version began with a failed meeting between the English Puritans and their king. So let's set the stage in the early 1600s. In 1603, Queen Elizabeth died, and James left Edinburgh and headed south to London for his coronation as the king. And on the way, he received a petition. It was called the Millenary Petition. And more than 1,000 English pastors had signed this, and it was the Puritans' request for reform in the Church of England. Well, King James called for a conference at Hampton Court. Hampton Court is this beautiful 1,000-room brick palace in this reddish rose brick that had been built almost a century earlier. And in January of 1604, the Puritans presented their requests to King James. Now, they had a whole lot of different requests that they made. One of them was for simpler Sunday worship in the Book of Common Prayer. And they said, we want the longsomeness of the service to be abridged, with no popish opinion any more taught. There are all sorts of things that they asked for, and almost everything that they asked for ended up being rejected. But in the end, even though he rejected almost all of their requests, King James did give them one thing that they asked for. One of the Puritans asked for a new translation of the Bible. Now, the reason King James jumped on that is because he despised the Geneva Bible. And the reason he did is because, in his own words, those notes in the Bible, that Geneva Bible, according to him, are very partial, savoring too much of dangerous and seditious conceits. So King James called for a translation without any theological or political notes in the margins. And in fact, in his orders for the King James Version, what became the King James Version, he specifically stated that there would be no marginal notes except those that were necessary to explain the Greek and the Hebrew and the Aramaic text. Now, translation on this new version began later on that very same year. There were 47 scholars that were brought together from both Puritans and from those who supported the Church of England as it was. And they were organized into 6 different teams. There were 3 Old Testament teams, 2 New Testament teams, and 1 team that translated the Apocrypha, those additional books that we talked about earlier. Now, those were put in a separate section of this new Bible, which was finished in 1609. And so it was in 1609 that they reviewed all of their different translations. And then in 1611, the first edition of the Authorized Version, or as it became known later, the King James Version, rolled off the printing presses in 1611. Now, here's what's interesting when we look at the King James Version and at Tyndale's translations. What we find is that at least 70% of Tyndale's translations end up coming over into the King James Version of the Bible. So when you read the King James Version, you are even then indebted to a man who died long before the King James Version was translated, William Tyndale. Now, it took several years for this new version, the King James Version, to catch on because many people still preferred the Geneva Bible. But once the King James Version caught on, it became the standard translation for English-speaking people for well over 250 years. Now, of course, there were other English translations as well. There had been, for example, the Reims Douay Bible, which was an English version of the Bible for Roman Catholics that had been translated from the Latin Vulgate. And the King James Version itself was revised several times over the years. And in fact, the version that we use today is from the 1769 Oxford revision of the King James Version. Now, in the 1700s as well as the 1800s, many older manuscripts were discovered than the ones Erasmus had used when he brought together his Greek New Testament. Remember, Erasmus only had about 7 Greek manuscripts when he brought together his Greek New Testament. But many others that were discovered were much older than the ones that Erasmus had had, and probably much more accurate than the ones that Erasmus had been able to collate together in his Greek New Testament. And so in the year 1870, the Church of England commissioned a new translation of the Bible that would take advantage of many of these new manuscripts and new discoveries about the Hebrew language. And in 1885, that translation was completed and became known as the English Revised Version of the Bible. It was published a few years later in 1901 in the United States as the American Standard Version of the Bible. Now, since that time, more than 900 translations of the Bible or parts of the Bible have been made in the English language. But even as we, as English-speaking people, have hundreds of translations available to us in our language, there are 180 million people around the world who have no part of the Scriptures available to them in their own language. Right now, even as we speak, there are at least 1,860 languages that need translation of the Bible done in those languages. And so just as William Tyndale prayed, "Lord, open the King of England's eyes," perhaps our prayer should be today, "Lord, open our eyes to the need around us, so that we train translators and we send translators, and so that we provide for the world the Word of God."